This week on The Impact, coming down to the wire, transportation leaders in the House and Senate work to find common ground on competing budget proposals, where the money will go and who's paying.
I mean, cars are becoming more fuel efficient. We're moving to electric vehicles. But the need doesn't go away. The need to have preservation and maintenance does not go away.
So that has been a concern, because if we're putting this burden upon the citizens that are using the highways, but they're not seeing the results, it's very disconcerting.
Plus, sky-high tickets and powerful cameras. The debate over new enforcement tools to keep intersections clear and catch HOV lane violators.
They caught 1,500 people in less than a week violating the HOV, and I think we need those penalties. I think we need to make sure that those are used for the correct purposes and transit's moving in those lanes as best it can.
That is, I believe, an invasion of privacy, where they're taking pictures of you in your car. Right now, that's against state law and the statute. So it's not just a simple case of raising the fines.
That's all coming up on The Impact.
From Olympia, an in-depth look at decisions at the state capitol and how they impact you. This is The Impact.
Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan. Maybe you carpool across the Columbia River Bridge for work, hop a ferry into Seattle, or commute on I-90. No matter how you get around, the state transportation budget has an impact on the infrastructure communities around the state rely on. With less than 2 weeks before the scheduled end of the legislative session, lawmakers are still ironing out the kinks in competing budget plans. On top of routine maintenance and emergency repairs to roads, bridges, ferries, and railways, transportation budget leaders also have to factor in the cost of complying with the federal court ruling that requires Washington to replace culverts which obstruct fish passageways. It's a multi-billion-dollar proposition.
The culvert has been front and center in the discussion this year. It's not a matter of if we're going to do this or when we're going to do this. It's really how that funding mechanism comes into play to address this. Our concern and my concern has been making sure we're dealing with this in a holistic way. So we're dealing up and downstream. The injunction is an area. WSDOT has many of these culverts identified within their project scope as part of in that injunction area. But we also have to talk to the cities and counties, the private landowners, because after all, if we're not doing this in a holistic manner, we're really not getting at the core issue here, and that's returning and preserving our habitat for salmon.
As every year, the most important part is just trying to get the transportation budget out. And this is, of course, a big year because it's the start of the fiscal year. In trying to do that and reconcile with the House as we go in the final 2 weeks. Kind of the big items that we are very concerned about is the culvert issue, the fish barrier issue, which we got sued by the tribes, trying to get another ferry constructed, and those are kind of the juicy, I guess, the most important parts. So I have a transportation package, but I don't know if that's going to go anywhere, but the needs are always there.
Arguably the most controversial aspect of Senator Steve Hobbs' transportation package was the carbon fee it contained. Hobbs says he expected pushback, but argues the big picture puts it in perspective.
Because I've seen all these transportation initiatives or carbon initiatives go out, and I've seen bills in the legislature dealing with carbon. Now, I've mostly been against those type of policies, unless, of course, that money goes back to transportation. The reason is because transportation makes up such a huge part of carbon output. And so if we're going to put a tax on carbon and we're going to put a burden on our taxpayers, then that money should come back to the taxpayers in form of infrastructure projects in local communities to help the fish passage issues, so to free up 1,000 miles of fish habitat, to electrify our ferry system, to get Washington moving again, and to make our environment better. And so that's my counter proposal to the efforts out there to tax carbon.
The future of the I-405 toll lanes is another sticking point for the legislature this year. Critics of the toll lanes say they haven't met the minimum average speed requirements set by lawmakers who authorized them on a conditional basis. Some would like to see the toll lanes turned back into general purpose or HOV lanes. Others who are in favor of the tolls want to make them permanent and issue bonds against the revenue they bring in to pay for transportation projects.
You know, the challenge is you have many schools of thought. Tolling was put into place to serve a couple objectives. One was to get congestion moving, with the ability to have some revenue come in, to add some capacity, especially on the 405 area. The metrics were for revenue and for speed. Revenue was met, speed was not. So that has been a concern, because if we're putting this burden upon the citizens that are using the highways, but they're not seeing the results, it's very disconcerting.
As chair, I kind of look at where the votes are on the committee and what is the best situation for the state of Washington. You know, bonding is a financing tool. It's just like if you buy a house, you don't buy a house with cash, you use a mortgage. Well, these major projects use bonding to do that. And so I know there's a couple of senators out there trying to work the issue, trying to get the 60% needed, 60% votes needed to pass, because when you do a bond bill, it's a higher threshold. If the votes are there to do it, I'm willing to do it. But if not, just a skinny down toll authorization bill is probably what we're going to do to ensure that 405 and 167 are getting the funding they needed.
Another big lift and a perennial point of discussion is the need to replace the aging I-5 bridge over the Columbia River that connects Vancouver, Washington to Portland, Oregon. Washington lawmakers are looking to restart discussions with their Oregon counterparts.
The discussion point in this budget is reopening the office, which is the start point once again to start going into the next phase of reviews and environmental and budgetary and everything else. But that's a mega project, obviously billions of dollars, and you know, it's one of many mega projects the state is looking at.
A wild card that could throw transportation funding into a state of flux is the initiative to mandate $30 car tabs. I-976 would save taxpayers money, but it would also cut the legs out from under a number of transportation projects around the state.
It's a big concern, but you know, the reason we're seeing an initiative like that and why it has a popular, you know, what we're seeing, a very popular, you know, messaging point, is because, you know, the people, especially in the Puget Sound region, are just seeing this massive piling on of taxes and fees. The concern is if we have that go into play and we see that revenue, you know, in this building, as I say under the dome all the time, it will not prevent us from looking at alternate sources of revenue. So whether they get it from one side, we're going to have to look at another side to do this, because at the end of the day, we're going to have the revenue to pay for the infrastructure and what is our transportation system in the state of Washington.
State leaders are also planning for a future where gas tax revenue may not be sufficient to cover highway maintenance.
I mean, cars are becoming more fuel efficient. We're moving to electric vehicles. But the need doesn't go away. The need to have preservation and maintenance does not go away. The need to build maybe a new bridge over the Columbia River on I-5, that does not go away. How do we fund these things? And so we got to start looking at those things like road usage charges. There was a pilot project. We're looking into it. We're not ready to pull the trigger on that and move forward. There's still analysis to be done. But these are some of the options that we have to look at to keep our transportation system working for Washingtonians.
I think that's really where the philosophical, you know, questions are going to come in. My role as a ranking Republican is we're of course looking at, you know, how do we do these things within the context of the revenues we already have in place? How do we project that out with efficiency? How do we get these projects done quicker? And really getting into the nuts and bolts of, you know, what are the reasons for the delays in these projects, whether it's environmental or permitting or all the different things along those lines. So it's going to be challenging, to say the least.
The increasingly transit-focused vision of the future promoted by some senior state transportation planners is also a matter of debate among different lawmakers in Olympia.
In my transportation budget, I address those needs of multimodal, what you're talking about, transit. We put some more money into commute trip reductions. We put more money into opportunities for small business to get an ORCA card pass for their employees, but also we look at preservation issues. We look at highway issues out there in Senator Patton's district out in Spokane Valley. I mean, those are all very important issues.
The push to go strictly towards a transit-based may work in some parts of this state, but they do not work in the whole state. And after all, we have to take into consideration how everybody in the state of Washington gets from point A to point B. Transit doesn't work in eastern Washington. It may work in certain segments, but not all. And right now the emphasis, of course, is around the Puget Sound region, but that can't dictate completely how the overall approach to transportation in Washington State is.
As chair, I believe I have to take a systematic approach. It doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat, right? There's no red roads, there's no blue roads. They're just roads, they're rail, they're ferries. So to your point, for example, the PCC rail line, which is very critical to eastern Washington, trying to get the funding for that. There was a landslide there, trying to get the money to repair that and to bring the Connecting Washington money, just keep it going and to repair that, to build it up. Ferries, like I said, we got to build a new ferry, and of course roads are always an issue, and we've got tolling that we've got to deal with in 405 and 167 and the Gateway project. So these are pretty big projects that we got to make sure that we keep the promises to the state of Washington on Connecting Washington, making sure these projects are on time and on budget.
Still ahead on The Impact, we look at some of the other transportation proposals being debated in Olympia, from traffic cameras that can see through tinted windows to the future of the controversial I-405 toll lanes.
Metro is running about 11 minutes quicker on the corridor than they did prior to the toll lanes, and that's a lot of individuals being moved in a bus at a time.
The people that sit on that corridor every single day will not agree with the statement just made around it's better.
But first, it's like Uber or Lyft for deliveries, why self-driving couriers could be coming to your doorstep. That's next, right after the break. Welcome back. If something you ordered shows up at your door but no one brought it, that means the governor signed House Bill 1325. The bill, sponsored by Democratic Representative Shelley Kloba, would create a legal and safety framework to authorize unmanned machines like these to operate on Washington sidewalks and crosswalks. The smartphone-summoned self-driving delivery robots from Starship Technology can carry about 20 pounds worth of goods. The company says they weigh 50 pounds, move 4 miles an hour, and typically deliver packages and groceries within about a 2-mile radius. The GPS-enabled delivery vehicles have a suite of sensors and cameras to allow them to get around. Representative Kloba says her bill defines them as personal delivery devices. It clarifies that they are not motor vehicles and requires them to yield the right-of-way to pedestrians. Kloba says she could see the autonomous delivery bots being popular in areas with a solid network of sidewalks and a lot of traffic congestion. Advocates of ending the tradition of setting clocks forward in the spring and back in the fall are one step closer to achieving their goal. A bill to put Washington on year-round Pacific Daylight Time, better known as Daylight Savings Time, has cleared the House and the Senate. House Bill 1196, sponsored by Democratic Representative Marcus Riccelli, was amended in the Senate, so it goes back to the House for final concurrence, but it has bipartisan support. The bill is similar to one backed by Republican Senator Jim Honeyford. Either way, even if the House concurs and the governor signs it, the bill will require congressional approval before Washington could actually make the switch. Up next, the debate over what should happen with the I-405 tolls and plans to use high-tech cameras to enforce HOV laws on the interstate and keep intersections clear in the city. We've got that and more right after the break. The budget's not the only transportation proposal in Olympia. Lawmakers are also weighing big changes to how the state catches and fines drivers for breaking the rules in an HOV lane or blocking a crosswalk or an intersection. There's also a debate about whether to make some controversial toll lanes permanent. Joining me now to talk traffic fines and more are Bryce Yadon, State Policy Director of FutureWise, also representing Transportation Choices Coalition in Olympia, and Mark Harmsworth, former state lawmaker and current research fellow with the Washington Policy Center. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Let's get right to it. There are bills to dramatically increase the penalty for HOV lane violations. Driving in the carpool lane with no one else in the car, this could wind up costing a violator nearly $200 for a first offense, up to nearly $700 for a third, and you can slap $200 in enhancement on top of that for anyone caught driving with a dummy to make it appear like they have a passenger. What are your thoughts about this, Bryce?
I think it's a good proposal. I think that when we look at the current rate of violations, WSDOT during a current enforcement, they caught 1,500 people in less than a week violating the HOV. And I think we need those penalties. I think we need to make sure that those are used for the correct purposes and transit's moving in those lanes as best it can.
What do you think, Mark?
Well, I think underlying in what's happening here, though, is there's the program they're going to have to create that's going to measure how many people are in your car, which WSDOT this year has put some budget proviso in for that. We don't know if it's going to pass yet or not. But that is, I believe, an invasion of privacy, where they're taking pictures of you in your car. Right now, that's against state law and the statute. So it's not just a simple case of raising the fines. There's a whole bunch of extra costs that's involved with this. Of course, we don't want scofflaws. But there's pieces to this that we need to consider as we go through this. And I, for one, I'm not looking to see WSDOT spying on me and my family in my car.
So Mark brought up an interesting point. The State Transportation Department is pursuing both some federal grant money as well as some state money to implement these. My understanding is these are cameras which can see inside a car, even through tinted windows, and can really detect the number of people in there. Is that a worthy trade-off for the concern about added congestion from HOV lane cheaters? I think
we need to just make sure how that data and information is being used. If we're using it for the proper reason, which is catching those who are breaking the HOV laws, I think that's a good trade-off to make sure that our transit's moving. We do need to make sure that our privacy around those and making sure those aren't used for other purposes is extremely important as well.
Well, on that note, there is another bill getting a lot of buzz right now, a bill that died and then came back from the dead, the Don't Block the Box bill. Now, this would allow the city of Seattle specifically to use red light cameras or traffic cameras to enforce other violations, blocking a crosswalk, blocking an intersection, or using a bus-only lane. And their privacy advocates raised concerns about what you were just talking about, which is will law enforcement have access to these pictures? And these cameras were put in place with these controls on them that they are specifically for enforcing traffic laws. So do you think that this bill accomplishes that?
Yeah, I think that, Rooted in Rights, as well as Transportation Choices, worked closely with ACLU on trying to make sure that we were protecting the privacy at the end of the day. These are very important laws to be following. We know that about every 3 days a pedestrian is hit in Washington State, which is not good. About 109 people died last year in Washington State as pedestrians. We need to make sure we're cutting down on that, and that is by preventing crosswalks from being blocked, which forces people into traffic and moving traffic when you can't see them. So I think this is, again, a very important bill, and we're working with the privacy rights folks to make sure that we're getting it right.
What's your perspective on this, Mark?
Well, it's a couple things that jump out with this particular issue. The first we've somewhat already touched on is the privacy side of things. Now the police are going to have access to who's in your car and to see when you're going around the corner there. The second thing really is your constitutional right to face your accuser. So if you're running through a red light, and we've got red light cameras in this state already where a car that you may own may go through the light. You may not know who's in the car, but you end up getting the ticket. That's not exactly fair. And so, again, there's a lot of issues with what's being proposed right now. And I'd rather see us take a step back and just look at the enforcement of red lights in a completely different way.
In general, I mean, when you look at the concerns about, I know there's a video that's gotten a number of views, which shows some individuals in wheelchairs in downtown Seattle trying to navigate around, big vehicles, and I'm sure you can't probably see them coming from the other side of the vehicle until they get around it. So there's clearly an issue or a concern. At the same time, how complicated would it be for the legislature to, once these are in place and once this is accepted practice, to go back and tweak the law, and then all of a sudden you've got what critics are concerned about, a surveillance system, maybe a surveillance state?
Yeah, well, to start off with, this bill currently is going to be a 2-year pilot program. So we're going to be collecting data on how it's used, what we're doing with it, and making sure that's protected. And I know that the city of Seattle, through their work with the privacy organizations, are making sure that that's used solely for that currently. And we're going to make sure that that continues that way. So again, understanding the safety trade-offs that we have, which are pedestrians getting put in harm's way and potentially getting killed, is a good trade-off at this point with the parameters that we we have and the continued work we're doing with those privacy organizations.
Anything to add on this topic before we change gears?
Obviously, the safety, it's important, but we've got laws on the books right now that just need to be enforced, and so Seattle just needs to be doing that rather than trying to put an additional burden on the drivers as far as tickets because they didn't quite stop in time or what have you. So.
Okay, looking at another issue, the I-405 tolls are a hot topic this year. They were approved by the legislature years ago on two conditions. One, a revenue target, which the tolls have met, and the other, a minimum travel speed goal, which the lanes have not met. Thousands of frustrated drivers and some lawmakers have proposed eliminating the tolls and turning them into either general purpose or HOV lanes. Supporters, however, want to make them permanent, and some want to bond against them to help pay for other traffic projects. What are your thoughts about this one?
Well, as you know, as a lawmaker, I was the one that proposed removing the toll lanes in the first place and have been a staunch advocate against having the toll lanes on 405. I think they penalize our low-income drivers because they really don't have a choice of when they're commuting as well. I would like to see those lanes removed and go back to a 4 general purpose lane and an HOV lane, which was promised to us, a 2+ HOV lane, which was promised to us as part of the package that we put together, the Eastside Transportation Association put together as well with the state legislature and local lawmakers in municipalities to improve the throughput on that corridor and reduce congestion.
What are your thoughts?
Well, we know that they're working currently. We went from having about a 56% target rate back before the toll lanes went in, up to about 81. So while we're not hitting that 90% of 45 miles an hour, I think we are moving in the correct direction. We have further tweaks and changes that we need to make to 405 that I believe will get us even closer, if not to that. And it's very important that when we look at tolling, we're looking at it in an equitable way, touching on the low-income folks. But it is an option; you're not required to, and it's a great opportunity if you are running late to use that, and it does go faster. It's also drastically helping transit. Metro is running about 11 minutes quicker on the corridor than they did prior to the toll lanes, and that's a lot of individuals being moved in a bus at a time.
The critics say this represents the state basically not keeping its promise. That the condition wasn't met, at least one of the two, and so that the toll lane should go. Is that fair?
Again, I think that we haven't completely implemented them along the entire corridor, and we have some more work to do. WashDOT's working very hard to make sure that we're meeting those as best they can. But at this point, we would be going backwards and regressing in the throughput on 405 at this point. It's better than it is on I-5 currently, and when we look at those numbers, we know that it's achieving a greater throughput, and more individuals and vehicles and buses are moving at a quicker rate than they were before. And we need to keep working on attaining that 90%.
We've got 2 minutes left. Do you want to add anything to this before we transition?
I mean, the numbers that DOT puts out, we can cherry pick the windows, but the people that sit on that corridor every single day will not agree with the statement just made around it's better. It's not. I mean, I commute that corridor as well, as many folks do. Our commutes are now significantly longer because of the toll lanes, and they're only getting worse. And there is no choice. If you're making $60,000 a year and you're a single parent, you can't afford to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on tolls because you can't choose when you go to work. So I want to see us go back. We've got data that shows 4 lanes and a 2+ HOV will increase throughput once you added in the extra lanes that were promised to us as part of that package.
Well, we've got just over a minute left, so briefly, if you could, the State Transportation Department's sort of long-term planning, mobility on demand goals. One of the stated goals is reduce vehicle ownership, in part concerns over congestion, also pollution. What are your thoughts about that policy?
Well, I think that we need to make sure that we're opening up more transportation options for everybody. That connects to land use, that connects to what modes people are getting around. I don't think that people driving to get to and from work is necessarily the worst thing, but if we can provide options that would reduce congestion, increase air quality, and provide better outcomes for everybody, I think that we should continue to work on that.
And closing thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, people spend a lot of money on their cars because they want the freedom of mobility to be able to go when they need to go to the grocery store. If you think about the young mom and the kid who wants to go to pick up some groceries, you know, transit's not an option for them. Maybe later in life it is. But we do definitely need options, but the way in which DOT is effectively having a war on cars, trying to remove our cars from the streets, we certainly need congestion relief. We're going to see a lot of new technology coming soon with autonomous vehicles. and we do need options, but the state also needs to consider that freight mobility and single occupant vehicles are important on our roads, and that right now they represent, and PSRC, the Puget Sound Regional Council, is also saying that our modality isn't going to change over the next few years. So lots of people are going to be using their cars for many years to come.
Looks like we could talk about this all day. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time. Mark, Bryce, thank you both for your insight. It's been an interesting discussion.
Thank you.
That's all the time for this week's show. We hope to see you back here for more in-depth interviews you won't find anywhere else. I'm Mike McClanahan. Have a great week.